Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Puppet Masters and Castle Freaks, the internet's leading all things Charles Band podcast. I am one of your hosts, Jared Hornbeck, coming to you, of course, from Brooklyn, New York, and I can promise you three things in this show: big podcast, big production, and big girls. I promise you all three of those things. But I'm not the only person here to sit down and have a movie chat. Who's across the Google Meet Zoom meeting from me today?
Well, this is Steve Guntley, and Jared, you displease me, and I ignore you. Because this is the podcast. It's all about space loincloths, knockoff Cylons, and crystal maces. That's because this is the podcast about slave girls from beyond infinity, a goofy, low-budget sexploitation film that has the rare distinction, or will have the rare distinction, of being discussed both on Puppet Masters Castle Freaks and on the floor of the Senate. So we finally have something in common with Jesse Helms, which I'm very excited about. I
thought we'd get there sooner than episode 48 or whatever this is. I thought we would get there.
You know,
but we're finally here.
We need to start building those bridges between long dead racist Senator Jesse Helms. But we are not discussing this alone. We have a very exciting guest here with us today. Who's here today, Jared?
Well, we are still here. And we have a very special guest, and I'm sure that guest is rolling his eyes right now. I looked down so that I wouldn't know, but he is a filmmaker, writer, director, directed the amazing We Are Still Here in 2015, co-wrote and made a movie called Mohawk with Grady Hendrix in 2017, and most recently directed the amazing Brooklyn 45 from last year, which I was lucky enough to see at the premiere. Amazing movie, such a good time. Ted Geoghegan is our guest today. Ted, what's going on?
Hey, how you doing? I'm happy to be here. We've been trying to make this happen for a long time, and we finally did. And what a momentous occasion and film.
That is true.
A great occasion to get together, and I just want to say thank you in particular because you've been a nice booster for our show, like since the early days when you really didn't have to, and that's really super cool of you to do so. And we're excited to have you finally on the show.
It should also be noted too that I didn't leave this in the introduction, but Ted is one of the two hosts of New York City's premier horror trivia event, Final Exam Trivia, which is monthly typically. At Rock Bar. Ted and Michael Gingold, who, if you're a horror guy, I'm sure you know that name, host my favorite game. I look forward to it every month. And you do, not surprising, you do a great job with that also, Ted. But I'm going to stop kissing your ass now, and I'm going to start
keep going. It's fine.
asking you some questions. And so I know you as a host of Final Exam and a director of some super cool movies. You're a guy with a ton of genre background and knowledge, which is apparent, just from talking to you, which is one of the reasons why I felt like you'd be such a good guest for the show. So in terms of, in the broader sense of horror, but also in terms of low budget stuff, indie exploitation, all that, when did your journey with these kind of often overlooked movies start?
Well, I grew up in rural Montana, and I really fell in love with genre cinema from a super young age, but it was sci-fi and fantasy. I was terrified of horror movies. I wanted nothing to do with them. It was just not something that I wanted in my life. The idea of being this nervous little kid from the prairie and making myself even more nervous and neurotic by watching horror movies was the furthest thing from my mind. And my best friend growing up, a gentleman named Dave Romanesco, he was a huge horror fan, and he would come to school all the time and tell me oh, I just saw Freddy, I just saw Jason, I just saw Pinhead. And just his descriptions of them were enough to absolutely petrify me. And Dave would always try to get me to watch horror movies, and I just steadfastly was no, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. And I remember at one of his birthday parties, Kevin Tenney's Night of the Demons had just come out on VHS. And it had this big, glorious standee at our local Hastings Books, Music, and Video. And I couldn't even walk past it. It was so terrifying. It was this gigantic cardboard stand-up of Angela with glowing eyes. And Dave rented it for his birthday, and I was so upset. And we sat there and we watched the movie, and I watched it from behind his sofa. And it was an afternoon birthday party. It was 2 p.m. and I'm watching Night of the Demons. And I just I was doing everything I could so they wouldn't notice that I was crying like the other kids. I was so absolutely out of my mind terrified. And I went home. My mother was so upset that she called Dave's mom to get mad at her about the fact that I was like paralyzed with fear. And all that did was just like further reiterate how much I didn't like horror. And years after that, I hear my son in the background getting terrified as we speak. But years after that, Dave came over to my house one night. He was like, look, I know horror's not your thing, but it's really special to me. And I'd love it if we could watch some horror movies together. And I was like, dude, I just don't like them. And he said, okay, well, I've got this movie for you. It's got Corey Feldman in it. He's from the Goonies. And you like the Goonies, don't you? And I was like, well, I do like the Goonies. And so he busted out Friday the 13th, the final chapter. And I was like, all right, I'll give it a shot. And Dave was just this, like, I mean, my age, but was just this total, like, big brother to me when it came to horror. And he was like, we're going to watch this movie, and every single time something scary happens or somebody gets killed, I'm going to pause it beforehand and let you know, just so, like, it doesn't surprise you. And I was like, oh, okay, all right. And I was like, but that just makes it scarier because I know it's coming. And so we watched the whole movie, and every single time something happens, you'd pause and be like, okay, there's going to be the special effect, and this thing's going to happen. And it's really crazy. And the guy who made the effect, his name's Tom Savini, and he's this and this. And by the time it was over, I was just completely enraptured. I was like, wow, that was actually really fun. It wasn't scary. It was actually like enjoyable. And he was like, good, because I've got the rest of the Tommy Jarvis trilogy for us to watch tonight. So we watched parts 5 and 6 right after that. And I never looked back. Like, I immediately, like, the next day, I went to the video store by myself, like, with my parents rather. I rented all the movies I could, and I just started obsessing. And this is the very early 90s at this point. So, like, no internet. So I started buying books. I bought every single book I could find on the matter. And I just started researching, and I started learning who all these people were. And it just became this absolute obsession. And I couldn't put it down, and I still haven't been able to this day. And, I equate so much of who I am to genre cinema, to horror in particular now, that I can't imagine my life without it. And I've literally emblazoned my body like most horror fans have with horror tattoos. But the two that I love the most, so I've got a Jason tattoo, and I've got a tattoo of Suzanne from Night of the Demons. The two movies that were integral to my start in loving these films.
Oh,
so
that's amazing, Ted. And I like that you said the word obsessed, because I think it's a certain kind of horror fan who gravitated A, towards hosting this podcast, or B, towards being a guest on this podcast, and C, towards listening to this podcast, where it's not just, we find we don't like really cross too many paths with just the casual fans. And that's my favorite part, is like yours, it took you a little longer to get there, but you got there. So that's all that matters. But it's like, it's just funny that it's all of these people say the same thing. Like, you saw that standee, I saw the Freddy Dream Warriors standee, Steve saw the Child's Play 3 billboard. And these were the things that kickstarted those relationships. And movies like the one we're talking about today, Slave Girls from Beyond Infinity, that's sort of what comes next. It's like you start with your prerequisites, and then you work your way into advanced obscure films. So Steve, why don't you fire off some stats about this weird little movie we're going to talk about?
Absolutely. And I just want to shout out that Ted said the word Hastings, because I also grew up in a Hastings market. So you have to love.
There weren't a lot of them.
Weren't a lot of them, and I don't think there are any anymore. At least they're not in my hometown. The one is
I
gone,
doubt
so.
it. There are not in Montana either. So what part of the world were you in that had Hastings?
Rural Colorado. So
so right there. Yeah, we're talking
right there. So that was my access point for a lot of those things. So R.I.P. Hastings. Pouring one out for a real one there. But Slave Girls from Beyond Infinity was released in 1987. I couldn't find a more specific date on that, but this was directed and written by Ken Dixon, and it stars Elizabeth Caton, Cindy Beale, Brink Stevens, Don Scribner, and Carl Horner. So in spirit, I think this movie is a throwback to the women in prison trend of the exploitation movies of the 70s. And there's a heaping helping of Most Dangerous Game with an extra sci-fi twist thrown in here for good measure. As with most Charles Band productions, this was funded and marketed on its title alone, hoping to court a little controversy for the sleazy title, and I think they may have courted a little bit more than they anticipated, because in 1992, this movie briefly became a political hot button after right-wing North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms signaled this out as the type of trash allowed on cable TV. Helms was attempting to launch this legislation that would require cable providers to block indecent materials unless specifically requested in writing. And this movie proved to be good fodder after he allegedly received complaints from constituents who came across this in a late night TV block. I'm willing to bet this was a USA Up All Night or something similar.
Oh, sure was.
This legislation.
That's exactly where it was.
That's where it was. Yeah. This
Yes.
legislation did not go through. I just love the thought of like Dixiecrat Jesse Helms like saying the words "slave girls from beyond infinity" on the floor of the most hallowed legislative branch of our government. I just think that's really funny that this came up, especially after watching the movie and seeing how incredibly tame this movie is, even by a lot of like other USA Up All Night standards. This is a pretty harmless, kind of pulpy movie, and maybe I'm just going off of the cut that I was able to see, but yeah.
Imagine
it's
clutching your pearls so tightly to find this movie indecent compared to even stuff we've watched on the short, history of the show.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are obviously lots of women walking around in scanty outfits. There's a little bit of a ravishment fantasy going on here, but all of it is either implied or it's kind of shot almost indifferently. It's not quite as indifferently as like the David Dakota Torchlight movies, but it's got that kind of matter of factness to it, where it's not trying to be particularly sexy or sexist, I would argue.
So Ted, I want to ask you, because sometimes, when we cast our net out for guests, people will be like, oh, send me a list of movies, and they'll look through the list, and some of them may pick one, or they might say, oh, tell me which one you think might be a good fit, and I'll check it out. You were adamant about Slave Girls from Infinity being the movie that you came on to talk about, and I want to know like a little bit about why. Like, I want to know what it is about this movie. Now, I know there obviously were ones that could have been earlier choices that were taken already, but you very much asked for this one. So I'm curious. For me, USA Up All Night definitely was where I first saw this, always hanging around those parts in the early 90s. But what is it about? What's your relationship with this movie?
Well, this movie has always kind of held hands with Sorority Babes and the Slimeball Bolorama. I think,
Sure.
Not just from a production standpoint, but I mean, silly titles and everything.
Mhm.
Like obviously, these are sister films.
yeah.
Like with titles like this, 100%. Also, they both share Brink, so
Nightmare Sister films.
That's right. Yes.
Hey.
Yeah. But I like that. But I grew up really loving Sorority Babes, and I watched that film a lot, and that was I think what I really adored the most about it was Buck Flower, who I've always had just the biggest crush on, and anytime I can see Buck Flower in something, I get excited. And years into my obsession with Sorority Babes, I was at the video store and I was like, what is this other? And I was like, wait a minute, Slave Girls from Beyond Infinity. And I was like, the box kind of looks the same. And I was like, what do we got here? Flipped it over. I saw Brink Stevens was in it. And I was like, okay. I was like, this looks like it's on the same level as silly. Like this looks like my kind of silly. And rented it and just fell in love with it. Like you just mentioned, it's this very tame film disguising itself as something that's tawdry. Like, I mean, the film's practically a PG film. It's absurd how tame it is throughout. And then, of course, yes, you do get some sexy moments and you get some kind of thrusty love making and whatnot. But it's really, overall, it is a wildly tame film. And you mentioned like which cut of it you saw. There's only one cut. There's the cut, and it's tame. It's not a it is not a film that was shot like harder and then they cut it down to something. Like this is the movie we got. Yeah, like this is it.
Yeah, we've encountered some like the Beach Babes from Beyond movies where there are like late night Cinemax cuts, and then there's like the R-rated like video store cut. And it seems like a candidate for one of those, but it didn't have anything like that.
Yeah, and I believe it's always been unrated. I don't think it was ever R. I think every release of it was unrated. I think that was always the language that they used around the film.
Which is wild to me, because aside from like topless scene, one or two topless scenes, I mean, it's like, not to sound like old man yells at cloud here, but it's like you could turn on MTV and see MTV Spring Break and see 10 times as many bikini clad people than you would see in this movie. And it's just, no one's really doing anything. There is the one sort of extended sex scene which starts as kind of a farce and then turns into a sex scene kind of abruptly.
Yeah, and the sex scene was kind of less convincing than the farce, like they were putting more energy and enthusiasm into pretend to have sex than to actually pretend to have sex, if that makes sense. But there's kind of like this old-fashioned sort of Saturday serial kind of energy to this movie. It's a lot of those same tropes. It's like, all right, so it's a jungle girl movie, and it's also a space movie. It's also a man hunting man movie, and there's monsters, and there's all these different kind of tropes are coming together in a ways that aren't really explained, or aren't necessarily cohesive. Like it's easy to forget you're on a spaceship in this movie.
It's kitchen sink cinema. And there's something so charming about that. And I mean, look at Sorority Babes. It's the same thing. It's like it's the monkey's paw, but it's also like this sorority girl movie. It's like a sexy sorority girl movie. It's also some kind of weird Fast Times at Ridgemont High thing going on. And it's also like a monster movie, and then it's got Bride of Frankenstein in it, and it's got all this other silly shit in it. It's like there's such a charm to those movies, and I absolutely love the idea of like just throw it all at the wall and see what sticks, and you just mentioned like it's a man hunting man movie. It's like, I mean, and I know you mentioned earlier, but like it's a sci-fi take on Richard Connell's Most Dangerous Game, which for anyone who doesn't know, that was this short story. Collier's Magazine published it back in the 1920s. And it has been milked by movies like ever since. And it's this like very simple story. It's like this big game hunter from New York City. His boat crashes on a Caribbean island, and when he's there, he meets this like Russian aristocrat who has killed every animal on Earth except for one, man. And it becomes that is the titular Most Dangerous Game, and he's going to hunt this guy. It's the hunter becomes the hunted, and I mean, it's. Like I said, it's been milked forever. Like there was like a straightforward version of it in the 1930s, and then it's just been like adapted again and again. It's like John Woo's Hard Target, Ernest Dickerson's Surviving the Game. Like even like John Leguizamo made like a comedy version of it called The Pest in like 1997 or 1998.
Right.
I think.
About The Pest.
Oh yeah, and it's atrocious.
It's so annoying. Yeah, the movie is so annoying.
Yeah, the goal of that was like, how annoying can we make John Leguizamo?
Yeah.
But like. It's this very straightforward concept of like hunting man is the most dangerous game, and like that, sure, that's a perfectly fun idea. Like and the short story is actually quite engaging. It's good, but like if I'm a filmmaker, which I am, I'm like, well, how do I take this and zhuzh it up a little bit? Like I got an idea. How about if instead of it being this big game hunter, it's two women. Like let's switch it up though. And why they're convicts on the run? And let's set it in fucking outer space. Like you just keep adding shit to it. Like I said, it really is that like throw it against the wall until something sticks, or preferably let it all stick and just end up with something like this. And I mean, like I just mentioned with Sorority Babes and the Slimeball Bolorama, I mean, it's the monkey's paw, another classic short story that's been milked a million times. Everything from like Leprechaun to Wishmaster to any of this stuff. It's like you make a wish, but the wish is bad. That's the whole concept of it. And it's like, it's fine, but like, why not have there be a little crazy imp who lives in a bowling trophy and a bunch of boobs and some silly frat boys? Like, yes, more of that, please. So,
and more Rutger Hauer and Ice-T.
That's exactly. Yep.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
so
More
many
Wilford
different
Brimley
versions
riding a
of this.
horse.
Yep.
Yeah. Come on.
Yeah.
Hard Target and Surviving the Game are two of my favorites.
They are a lot of fun.
They're very fun. I could watch Hard Target any damn time.
Yeah.
No, and I appreciate that they are taking that approach to it. And there's something about the production values on this one, which just they feel significantly reduced from even the average like Empire or Full Moon feature of this time. This feels
absolutely
cardboard robot cheap.
Yeah, and not only like the robots, like the faux Cylons. But they go from like real locations to cardboard sets like in the blink of an eye. Like it's like, well, let's walk up this stone staircase into this like 30-foot tall room that clearly doesn't have a ceiling because they didn't build one. And it's like, yeah, it's and the thing is, like, I love that. I absolutely adore that. Like there's such charm to that I don't get from other cinema. And it's like, who do you praise? Who do you blame for something like that? I mean, it goes either way, and it's like, the guy who directed this, Ken Dixon, who also wrote it, like, I don't know if you guys know his history, but like he made this movie. He made this movie in the 70s called The Erotic Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, which is terrible. Just like, as somebody who really enjoys like silly softcore or even silly hardcore stuff, it's so bad. So he made this movie and it did okay. Like, it actually made some decent money, but it's like it was all just based on how silly it is. Like at the time they were doing like, naughty Cinderella, and they were doing naughty Snow White, and they were doing all these like basically like what sort of classic literature can we throw boobs into? And it's like, and so he made this thing, but then after that he made these 3 video compilations that if you went to Hastings Video, you probably saw all 3 of them because they were always in the horror section. And they were these weird, like very early VHS video compilations of horror stuff. And he made 2 of them. He made 2 of them in 1982. He made this one called The Best of Sex and Violence. That was basically just like violent scenes from horror and action movies, like intercut with boobs. Yeah, exactly. And then he made another one called Famous TNA, and they both of those came out in 82, and they were like at every video store, and they made a fortune. Those 2 did. They were huge because it was like, and not only that, but it's so early on in the VHS craze that video stores were just buying everything. Like if you had a movie, and that's really where these films came from, was we don't have a movie, so let's cut all this into a movie, throw it on tape, and then charge the video store $79.99 so that they can have another title on their shelf. And so these 2 made a ton of money, and the next year after that, he made another one called Film Gore that is basically the exact same thing. So it's like he made the best of Sex and Violence, and then he made one about sex, and then he made one about violence. And a lot of them just reshare the same clips. Like, so all 3 of these weird compilation movies he put together, and then he kind of disappeared for a while. And then a couple years later, he made this movie called Zombie-thon. And it's this girl, and she's like walking down the street, and all of a sudden all these zombies show up, and she's like, oh no, zombies, what do I do? And she runs into a movie theater, and she sits down in the theater, and she watches a compilation of other zombie movies for an hour and a half. So it's like,
because nothing else would calm you down more than surviving a zombie apocalypse than watching a bunch of
zombie movies.
Makes sense to me.
But it's so absurd. It was like he made a feature, then he made 3 compilations, and then he made a compilation with like a wraparound story.
Right.
And
and Film Gore is Elvira hosted that one.
Elvira's in Film Gore, yeah.
Yeah, because that's how I've watched it. And this is a fascinating filmography of Ken Dixon when you look at it, because if you just pull the IMDb page up, it's really like it really reads like a Troy McClure filmography.
Right.
Like, it's like, you might remember me from such movies as The Erotic Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, The Best of Sex and Violence, Famous TNA, and Zombie-thon. Yep. And I love that aspect of it, because it's like, no, this is a real person, and this is just a real body of work, which is amazing. And then we get to this feature, and boom, and
this is the last thing he works on.
And this was the end of his career. So, and then Slave Girls came along, and out he went. So, and I know very little about what he ended up doing after this. I don't know if he remained close with band or if he worked behind the scenes under a different name, as is often the case in that community. But he did just kind of seem to disappear. With two narrative features, 3 compilations, and a weird narrative compilation. Like what a weird filmography, but like what an interesting
very
one
similar
too.
It's very similar to a filmmaker we covered last week when we talked about the movie Ghost Town. It's a guy named Richard McCarthy who came from seemingly nowhere, kind of bullied his way onto the set of this movie, directed it for a couple weeks, quit before the movie was over. No one's heard from him since. The only other credits he has were like working on Benny Hill specials that were released only in Australia. Like such a weird, like, who is this guy? Where did he go? Like, this is such a strange, like, mystery man kind of director.
That is wild. Yeah, I'm not familiar with him.
Yeah, fun kind of parallel there. And I mean, it's there's a lot of interesting cast members going on here too. I was looking up the star here. Her name is Elizabeth Caton.
Oh, she's amazing.
She's really fun, and she came across this role allegedly by accident. She caught a ride with a friend of hers who was a production assistant after her car broke down. They had to stop off and drop off a few things at a film set, and the producer for this film spotted her and asked her to audition for it. Originally, she didn't want to take it because she thought it sounded too like smutty. But then they sent her the script, and she thought it was actually funny and came on for a smaller role. But then the original lead was Ginger Lynn, who old fellas might know as a porn star back in the 70s. She apparently was not quite right for this part and just wasn't really getting it, which makes me wonder, like, how, seeing some of the actors that made it into the film, it just makes me wonder kind of what she was doing.
My understanding was that she was originally going to be playing Brink's role.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
okay.
And that once she was bumped up to the lead in the film, they brought Brink on because she's an easy get. And I say that with love to Brink, but it was somebody that they could be like, yo, we need to fill this role. Let's make this happen. And we've got her number on speed dial. So that was my understanding of how she ended up in the lead of the film. And it's like, she's, it's like I feel like all the horror fans remember her like she's the one who gets tossed out the window in Friday the 13th Part 7 New Blood.
Right. I was going to say before, Ted, you were watching Part 4 with your friend and he paused it before all the deaths. Did you get tired of him saying this person's going to get thrown out of a window?
Yeah, right, exactly. Yep. Here comes another window.
Take a shot.
Yeah.
Well, her death in New Blood, famously, heavily cut. She had this really brutal death where like her abdomen gets all slashed open and it's like really nasty. Yeah. And it was one of the ones that they were like, we got to get rid of this. So it just turns into like, whoop, out the window. Like unlike so many others.
Ken Dixon, her filmography is crazy with genre stuff. I mean, she was in Silent Madness. And then she was in Silent Night, Deadly Night 2, which is one we know is just like a movie that a lot of cult people are familiar with. She did this movie and a movie called Necromancer, and then Assault of the Killer Bimbos, which we'll get to soon. New Blood, she has a small part in Twins, and then Dr. Alien. She's in a movie with one of my favorite titles ever, which is Rollerblade Warriors: Taken by Force. And then she just went on to keep doing genre stuff, including like 4 Vice Academy sequels. Speaking of Ginger Lynn.
Yeah, she's in, I think, 3 through 6, right? She's like, I mean, those were like the Charlie's Angels, Police Academy sort of softcore movies that, again, every video store in America bought up those sequels.
And I need to shout out one of the weirder credits that she has, a movie I did not realize existed, a movie called Beretta Road, which stars and is written by Franco Columbu. If you don't know who that is, he is the best friend bodybuilder of Arnold Schwarzenegger. And this is a starring role for Franco Columbu. And Schwarzenegger actually has a cameo as himself in this like absolute bargain basement movie that nobody's heard of. And it made me really want to track that down just to see. I think he has like one scene where he's helping him work out and that's it. But he's in the box art. That's just one of those, sometimes you'd go on these deep dives on IMDb and you just discover something like that becomes like fascinating to you. I love it. I also need to shout out this movie. So I watched this movie on the Full Moon streaming app.
Oh yeah.
And I texted Jared this. I'm like, it is kind of hilarious how good the 4K transition of this movie on the Full Moon streaming app is. They did a super professional, loving job of up-resing this movie and cleaning it up and making it ready for 4K TVs, which ironically just only highlights how very, very cheap everything in this movie looks and makes it like 10 times more charming in that regard. Like, I was really genuinely impressed with how good this movie looks.
Yeah, I watched it twice. I watched it once on Tubi, and it was I don't think it was the 4K restoration. And then I watched it on the Full Moon app yesterday, and I was like, yeah, it looks amazing. Like shocking compared to movies of presumably 4, 5, 6 times the budget of this haven't been remastered and look kind of like shit, or they're remastering slightly, muddy. I mean, this looked like almost at times as good as far as a restoration as like Cellar Dweller or Netherworld does on the app. And I mean, but there's obviously moments where the sets are showing and the very 2D aspect of a lot of the surrounding sets and areas is very clear. But yeah, it looked gorgeous, and so that's why I went back and watched it again. I mean, it's 74 minutes. Like, what am I going to do with 74 minutes? I had time to watch this twice.
Exactly.
Yeah. You know that at least 15 minutes of those are going to be credits. Yeah, you're good. Yep. Yeah. No, I was watching this and thinking, like, this is so pure in its cheesiness that it feels like when modern sitcoms are trying to make a parody of a bad movie, like, or when the Simpsons sit down to watch something and it feels like it's a broad parody of this type of movie, but this just feels like it's based on this movie. Like well, it's exactly that.
This film has so much heart, just like Sorority Babes. Like, it's the type of movie that we don't get anymore because people can't look at films like this without seeing these movies. And so everything just ends up becoming a parody of these films instead of being one of these films. And to me, it's one of those things where, like, I relate this very closely to, like, trauma. Sure. I love the concept of trauma more than I love trauma. I love what they do. It's just not for me. That. Yeah,
I get that.
And like, I really adore the first Toxic Avenger. And I think what I like so much about it is there a bunch of guys making like this really gory superhero trash movie in Jersey? Like, how fun is that? And then it's like, with each passing film, they're kind of remaking Toxie in their own way. Like, even if Toxie has nothing to do with it, which weirdly he has something to do with almost all those movies. But they never had that sort of purity that the original Toxic Avenger had, where it felt like they weren't aping something. They were just making weird, fun, trashy art. And every film after that was like, from the makers of the Toxic Avenger, how can this live up to the Toxic Avenger? Do we acknowledge the Toxic Avenger? Like, this sort of thing where it's like, just make more weird, silly shit that's yours.
Yeah.
And
I think
both these movies are that, they are weird, silly shit that is like absolutely someone's.
100%. I think that's a really distinction between what Trauma does and what Full Moon does. And I think Full Moon, they're also similarly aware that they're working in a low budget milieu, but like they're always trying to kind of reinvent something. They're not just trying to recreate the success of Puppet Master every single time. Well, although you could argue every movie has a tiny terror, but I think that's more of a Charles Band thing that predates Full Moon in a lot of ways than anything else. But they are trying to mix up genres a little bit, especially in the early days of Full Moon.
Yeah, nobody's going to argue that like Trancers or Subspecies is aping something. Those movies are just straight up like somebody had a weird idea and they went with it. Like,
exactly.
And God bless, and that's the joy of it.
And I think this movie is much more fun than some similar films that we watched recently, Beach Babes from Beyond 1 and 2, because this movie has no cynicism about it. Like you said, there is kind of that scrappy, let's make a picture kind of endearing quality to it, and yes, the acting is wooden and the production looks like really
acting
cheap
and the sets are wooden. Yes.
Yeah, everything's wooden. Everything in this is wooden, but there is a goofy charm to it that I look for in the quote unquote good bad movie genre, and I think this one fits that because it may not be trying to be a masterpiece, but it's also not. It doesn't feel like someone's got a gun.
I feel like everyone's wooden except for Brink, despite some of the dialogue she has to deliver, because her presence is always welcome in a movie, and she does have to kind of have this like deep philosophical aside, taking this guy to task, and it seems a little bit out of place for the movie, but it's Brink Stevens, and so it's welcome. But Elizabeth Caton too, like, she's giving a real energy to saying these ridiculous, like, scientific gobbledygook lines, which seems so weird coming out. And I just
the opener
I
of the film, the opener of the film, when she like figures out how to escape from the chains and then how to escape from the prison just by touching them together. Yeah, it's like, and she's like, well, I short circuited it by combining and it's just like, oh Jesus H Christ, like go on, explain to me how you got out, like on a budget, because clearly the real answer was the only way we can afford to show these women escape from prison is by literally having them walk out the door of the cardboard prison. Like we cannot have a jailbreak, we cannot have a giant riot. No, we're going to have her like basically touch her wrists together, and it short circuits out everything. And then they're just like, get on a ship and go. And it's like, yeah, do it, bring it. It's all I want.
feels like a design flaw. Yeah.
It does feel like somewhat of a design flaw there in the space prison. But you know, and it's weird because you know the other actress in it, Cindy Beale, you know, who's Tisa, right? I think that's her character. Yeah, it's like she's like best known for this movie. Like she is not somebody that folks really even know. Like she had like a little part in My Chauffeur the year before this, but like that's kind of it, you know. And it's like a tiny little like, here she is, she's gone sort of thing, like practically a glorified extra.
Yeah, I think both her and Elizabeth Caton were models primarily, like more than actresses. Yeah.
And I'll just say this, no disrespect to Cindy Beale, but maybe this profession's not for everyone.
No, and the thing is like she's even in a movie like this, the other performers are definitely acting circles around her. Like it's true, but like she puts a lot of heart into it. She's super spunky. And like, what are movies like this without those performances? Like I didn't sign up to watch Shakespeare, you know, like that is not what I'm here for, you know. But I mean, the flip side of that, like which I find very charming, is you've got like Don Scribner, who's acting like he's in a Shakespearean tragedy, like throughout the whole film. Like he is like, I'm gonna give this thing it all, you know.
He's certainly dressed like he is.
Yeah, no shit. Yeah, right. And I mean, every single moment of this is just him acting his ass off, and that doesn't necessarily mean he's acting amazingly. It means that it's like you made the joke about The Simpsons a little earlier, Troy McClure, and I'm gonna take that one step further, and I'm gonna make the Calculon reference from Futurama, but like that's very much like the Calculon school of acting, where it's like you hold one hand against your chest, you hold the other hand high up in the air, and you scream "acting," and that's acting. And that's very much like Don Scribner in this movie, and
100%.
Yeah, and I just like you know, he's been in a million things. Like I see him pop up and shit all the time. He's still working to this day. Like I'll watch like no budget movies that are coming out to this day. Movies that like the AFM poster movies where you're just like, wait, they made a movie called that, and you look and it's like with Don Scribner. And you're like, all right, man, like committed to it. Like this bit is a long-running bit for you, Mr. Scribner.
Oh, and he's kind of like copying fashion tips from like General Zod, you know, like he's got
General Zed.
General Zed.
There you go.
You know what's funny is like, I mean, you know, here in America, you know, we say the letter Z, but you know, in most other English-speaking countries, they say Z for the last letter of the alphabet, and that's like a clear to nerds like me who grew up reading Most Dangerous Game, like the bad guy in the Russian hunter in Most Dangerous Game is also a Z name, which is fun. He's what is it, Zoror? Oh god, it's just jumped out of my head now. I'm like Zarkar. It's something
Zarkor.
Zarkor. Is that?
I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
guys. It's Zardoz.
It is Zardoz. Yes. No. Yeah, I think it is Zarkor. Now that you say
Yeah.
that sounds right.
That's
'Cause,
one
yeah,
of the Monster Island movies. Yeah, we haven't gotten to those yet. I'm excited to check those out.
Yeah.
But yeah. So it's like his name, like the letter Z, is like, okay, let's acknowledge that he's playing this same character. It's just a little nod there, and instead of calling him Z, call him Zed. It's just same diff, but a cute little nod, because honestly, the film, outside of the Let's Hunt People, really doesn't have any like direct references to the Most Dangerous Game. Like, none of the other characters are named after anybody. I mean, in the Most Dangerous Game, it was a guy, two dudes being hunted by the Russian aristocrat or whatever he was,
Yeah.
So, but
I mean, it's such a flexible premise for a story too.
Exactly.
Which means you can kind of adapt this to everywhere. And of course, they have the customary like villain sits you down for a fancy urbane dinner and conversation before he, hunts you down into the space jungle where it's convenient.
My true agenda. Yes.
I love too in this movie that like you would think there might be like a logical path to say like, okay, well, they're wearing these like loincloth bikinis, but that's because he's on this space station that he's outfitted to look like a jungle and he's working through some kind of fantasy there. But no, they came in the bikinis. They were in that was their space prison uniform. They were already wearing those when they got to the jungle island.
This is convenient.
Yeah, this worked out very well. You guys already had the dress code all set up. So
yeah. Oh God, what a gift.
I love little things like that, and these movies are always just fun because even at 74 minutes, you can never really say they're wasting your time. And it's light and goofy enough and just kind of like scrappy and pleasant in a goofy kind of way.
Well, that's really what it comes down to. And I mean, one of the central reasons why I picked a movie like this is my filmography, as a director at least, is pretty heavy. I write pretty heavy, heart-wrenching sort of stuff. I want to tell stories that kind of hit you in the gut a little bit. I don't want them to break you, but I certainly like they've got some weight behind them, and those aren't the type of movies that I like to watch. Those are the type of movies I like to make. What I like to watch, I mean, the world is such a heavy place, and it seems to just be getting heavier. And every single day I wake up and I begrudgingly look at the news, and I see all these horrible things that are happening to people all around the world, and I see about what horrible things happening to people here in the States. And I just see all this injustice and all this sadness. And I don't want any more of that when I wrap up my day and I want to plunk down on the sofa. Like, at the end of the day, I do want something light. I want something silly, and I want something goofy, and not to get all poignant, but like, the world throws some pretty heavy shit at you. And, I had a son and daughter who, twins named Maggie and Flash, who were born and passed away shortly after. And when my wife and I lost them, we didn't know what to do with ourselves. We were ruined. We had no idea where life was going to take us next. And we told ourselves, like, we need to get out of this rut. We need to find ways to move forward. We need to find ways to like find joy in the world. And a few days after Maggie and Flash passed away, I said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to watch all the Police Academy movies. Like the silliest fucking thing I could think of. And we did. We watched all 6 of those movies. Oh God, 5 and 6 are just painful. But we watched these movies, and they took us away from the pain we were feeling and the agony we were feeling, the stupidity and just the sheer audacity of this filmmaking healed us. And movies like Slave Girls from Beyond Infinity, like so much of bands' oeuvre, it's so important, and people don't always get that. And it's so easy to be flippant about these movies. It's so easy to roll your eyes at these movies, but these movies save people's lives. People need this escapism, they need this absurdity, and they need this like stupid fun. It's so fucking important. And it's why I will always go to bat for movies like this. And it's frankly, it's why I don't want to talk about subspecies. It's like, I want to talk about silly shit. I like talking about this goofball shit with you. And as I'm telling you all this, I've got my son giggling and laughing over here. Like that's life, man. That's such a joy. And to me, like, I mean, there's nothing else on earth at the end of the day that I'd rather sit down to than something with a title like this and with actors like this. Give me as wooden and as silly and as dopey as you want. Like I'm here for it, and I'm ready to embrace it and love it.
I love that. Thank you so much for
Mhm.
sharing that. That was a really beautiful, well put thought, and I agree with you. Like it's kind of the Sullivan's Travels argument, you know. It's the Preston Sturges thing. It's like, I want to go out and make serious art, but that's not what people want. You know, people are living their lives, and life is hard, you know, and like sometimes we just need to get away a little bit.
Amen.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I would say, like, for me, I've noticed, as in the time that we've been doing the show and setting up the movies in the spreadsheets and looking ahead, like, oh, this is one that I wasn't familiar with, but I've never seen, or one that I, had seen and look forward to revisiting again, whatever the case might be, like Sorority Babes and the Slide Ball Bolorama, which I, had seen a handful of times throughout my life. It's really kind of made me appreciate the craft of people just like coming together and putting something out there, getting it made, and embracing the silliness in a lot of ways. Like, I definitely spent, as much as I've always loved horror and genre stuff, I always did. There was always a part of me that was stuck in being an asshole film snob. And I found that, especially even in the time we've been doing the show, like, I'll see a commercial or a trailer for something that looks really big and sort of like mind blowing. And in my brain, I'm like, I'll eventually watch that. But like, I don't want that right now. Like, what I want instead is to sit down and watch Slave Girls from Beyond Infinity, or, or Blood Dolls, which it has become one now in my new full moon rotation that we both really loved and hadn't seen prior to recording the episode. But I totally echo what you're saying. It's like, there's something just so nice and comforting about the earnest silliness of this. And it is very silly. If you're looking for art, you're looking for Shakespeare, look elsewhere, but you're not going to find a cynical bone really in this thing, aside from maybe looking at it as a chance to cash in on the VHS boom. But aside from that, I don't think there's
show business is a business. That's part of it. You can't do the show without the business. So,
and filmmakers like to make these throwbacks to the serial era, to the adventure stories of their kids, and some of those filmmakers are Steven Spielberg and some of them are Ken Dixon, but the spirit remains the same. The spirit is still there, and I do appreciate that.
I look forward to the very near future when we have a 1-star review on Apple Podcasts where someone says these idiots compared Steven Spielberg to Ken Dixon, and that's all the review says, 1 star.
Anybody can take me to task. It's like I turn on the TV right now and I'm bombarded with these terrifying images of what's going on between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I turn off the news. Do you really think I want to watch Oppenheimer? Fuck you. I want to watch Witch House 2. Like that's like, no, like, and it should be so obvious that these movies are important and that these movies are special. And I'll go to my grave singing their praises.
And to echo what you're saying,
special.
Ted, you asked a question at final exam last time. There were a couple of questions about, I think like 2 or 3 of the questions we didn't get correct were ones based on pretty kind of obscure deep cuts in the movies. But I went back and I took notes from it. Here are some things I want to watch. And so I was off that week from school. And rather than being like, I have a big chunk of time, what do I want to watch? Do I want to watch Zone of Interest? Do I want to watch Oppenheimer? Do I want to something like that? I was like, no. And I took out the list I made from final exam. And I said, this week, I'm going to watch The Nest. I'm going to watch Dr. Giggles. And I'm going to watch, and I ended up watching about 10 movies over my break, which all were kind of like a mix of comfort watches that I've seen or stuff that I hadn't really seen and got wrong at final exam. And I was like, this is all I care about right now. I mean, we did get the question about The Nest right, but the Dr. Giggles one stuck in my craw. And so the next morning I texted my teammates and I'm like, look, I'm watching Dr. Giggles. And you know what? I loved
Yeah.
it. I sank into my couch and I drank my coffee and I watched Larry Drake put on a clinic.
You had a
Figuratively
you
and
had a giggle.
literally.
Yo, that movie's a banger. It's fun, man. I don't care. Like, not snide in the slightest when I say like that's a franchise that should have taken off. That movie is, and it's crazy when you watch that film because it's a Universal movie, and like they must have thought it was going to be a franchise because man, that movie looks big. There are shots in that film where you're like. I'm like, I'm sorry, is that a crane shot over like a county fair with like 500 extras? Like this is not a cheap movie. Even the way they
Haskell Wexler shot this movie? What?
Yeah. Well, it's nuts. It's like, I mean, the way they light the neighborhoods and the houses at night. I like as a filmmaker, I'm like, I know how many lights it takes to get that to look like that, and it ain't cheap.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Here's to loving the ones that are cheap and loving the ones that aren't cheap.
Amen to that. Ted, we know you've got kind of a heart out here, so we don't want to keep you too long, but it's been unbelievable talking to you. This has been so
Such
cool.
a pleasure.
Where can people find all of your films? And do you have anything that you want to plug that you've got coming up? Where can people find you?
Easiest places to find me are on most social media platforms. I try my best not to be on them too much, but I just like everybody, I'm there. Just the name, it's Ted Geoghegan, TEDGEOGHEGAN. You can find me on any of those. You can find my movies on pretty much any VOD platform. I'm fairly sure, at least stateside. I'm fairly sure that you can get them on pretty much anything. My new one, Brooklyn 45, is available on Shudder and is also available to rent on pretty much all other platforms. And I'm not sure I'm supposed to say this yet, so don't post it online. But I guess for anyone who's listening to this, there will be a really gorgeous Blu-ray release of Brooklyn 45 coming out
Awesome.
early summer. And it's got a really fantastic half-hour making of that I'm really proud of. So if you liked
amazing.
the movie, I hope you will check that out. And it also has another rather unexpected extra that I'm definitely not allowed to mention, but it's really rad, and I think people are going to get a real kick out of it.
I will firmly recommend your movies. Like genuinely, you're a caliber of filmmaker that I'm a little surprised you came on our show because of like, this guy's really good. Oh my God. So I'm really excited to have had you here. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And We Are Still Here is terrific. And Brooklyn 45, I was lucky enough to go to IFC Center for when it premiered here last summer. Just so much fun, such a great event. Everyone loved the movie, and everyone was just in such high spirits, watching the movie, having drinks and socializing after. It was just such a fun event to be a part of. And so I'm glad to have been there. And I always, when people ask for recommends for stuff that came out, last year or stuff that just dropped on Shudder, I always try to recommend Brooklyn 45 for people to watch. Really one of my favorites of last year. And I say that sincerely, not just because I'm staring across a computer screen at its director. I promise.
I deeply appreciate that. And I appreciate all that you guys do to champion these movies. Like I said, I mean, I do not speak lightly when it comes to this sort of cinema. It is really important to me, and genre films and hokey genre films have saved my life, and it's so important that people continue to champion these movies in a non-condescending, non-ironic way, and to really appreciate what these movies are and what they do for people. So thank you.
I'm going to say something here, which I don't generally speak this way on mic, but I will say I in doing some research for this show, I was like, I wonder, Slave Girls from Beyond Infinity and some of these kind of kookier titles have maybe been covered by other podcasts in the past. And so I looked through and I found only a handful of over the last 5-6 years who did an episode on the show. And a lot of them are kind of bite size, like a little, this is a weird movie, check it out, 10-minute long little thing. But I found that the only other approach people were taking to this they were trying to make it a comedy show. And I felt like the whole way that they were approaching the movie is like, we're going to make jokes about everything. And we're going to just kind of compare it unfavorably to everything. And really that's fine because comedy movie podcasts exists. Like that's a part of the market that exists.
If that's your agenda. Yeah.
But I feel like our agenda with the show has been from the beginning to, even though we do nitpick and we do come across things we generally don't like and have a hard time
we're going to be
speaking.
about
It doesn't
Well,
loving something doesn't mean that you shouldn't and be critical of it.
Of course.
That's also very important. You should absolutely anytime you're talking about art, be critical of it. I actually really appreciate it when my friends tell me things they didn't like in my movies, because I know that's kind of harder for them to do than other films, because it's like, oh, I know this guy put a lot of work into this and I know he tried really hard, but I really didn't like this. And I'm like, good. Like movies shouldn't be for everyone. Not
No.
everyone should like everything. My day job is I'm a film publicist, and I regularly will be repping a movie, and it gets all these great reviews, and it's like on the festival circuit, and it's 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. It's got 15 reviews, and they're all positive. And then that one negative review comes in, and the filmmakers are just crushed. And their movie's still like 96% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, but it's not 100% fresh anymore. And it just kills them. And I always try to explain to them, like, your movie should not be 100. No movie should be 100% fresh. No movie should be liked by everyone. Like, that's important. Art is not for everyone. Every single piece of art should be dissected. It should be liked. It should be disliked. That's important. And I frankly, I don't trust a movie on the IMDb that's got 100% fresh. I'm like, what the fuck is going on here? Like,
it establishes a standard that that movie can't possibly meet, and then you're going to go into that movie like, all right, well, this can't be as good as I've heard,
right. And also, like,
fail,
what constitutes a positive review? Like, for some, it could be 3 out of 5 stars. So 100 critics could give a movie 3 out of 5 stars, but the implication when you see that 100% fresh is that people are giving this 100% grade, which is really not.
Kudos for knowing more about Rotten Tomatoes than most people, because that is a big part of it, and it's why Metacritic is actually a much more accurate representation of what critics think of a film, but it just doesn't have a fun name like Rotten Tomatoes. So most people don't go there.
Ted, like you were saying, like, we do try to approach this material from a place of respect and a place of love and reverence. And I think even as the show's been going on, there are hallmarks of certain directors and certain sub-genres within this that we're really coming to appreciate now that maybe weren't on our radar. And so, I know that we've appreciated doing the show, and fans have appreciated listening to how we've been treating these properties that they care about. And if you like what we do on the show, the best way to show us is to jump on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and drop us a 5-star rating and maybe a brief review if you feel so inclined. You can also follow us on all of our social media. We are on Instagram at puppetmasters_castlefreaks. You can follow me at _Giallo_Jerry or Steve at Minotaur Matador. You can also find us if you look for us on X or Blue Sky or Threads and any of those other YouTube, any other social media platforms. We're not the only show, though, that Steve needs to give a little plug to. So, Steve, where else can people listen to you?
You can also hear me on my show, Cinema Arcade. That's cinema and arcade all mashed together, because that is what we do. We are watching movies and then playing the video games based on those movies to see how they enhance or detract or enhance each other, or just kind of go in completely batshit directions. We just covered Seven Samurai, which has a bizarre PS2 game that takes place in the distant future and has basically nothing to do with the movie. It follows the plot points, but you're literally battling robot gorillas. It's the weirdest possible direction you could take Seven Samurai, but I had an amazing time revisiting that movie either way. So check that out wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to check us out next week, because we are going to be closing a little chapter here. Closing a little chapter on the Empire of Screams DVD boxed set, which we have gotten a lot of enjoyment out of. We're watching the last film in that collection, and luckily it is going to be Stuart Gordon's Dolls. So we're going to have a really fun conversation about Dolls. I know that's a movie a lot of people have wanted to hear us talk about, and it's also one that I think we've pushed this episode the most. Like, it's been rearranged in our organization
so
many times. So I'm excited to dig into it.
Yeah, and just Ted, while you're on the line, and for listeners, they may not pick up on this, but we have a very special guest who's joining us on that episode, and that person may or may not have produced the special features for that box set.
Yay!
Ooh.
So listeners, tune in next week to hear us and a very special guest talk about a very revered Empire classic from the 1980s, Stuart Gordon's Dolls. Stay tuned. We'll see you next time.
Bye.